Hello. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. So for those of you who've been listening to our podcast, this is going to be a little bit of a preview of our next episode, discussing some of the things that are there. For those of you who are not regular listeners to our podcast, we'll give you a little bit of background information so that you can catch up and hopefully listen to the rest of it. So Revolution 1 is the story of the Tunisian Revolution in 2011. Which was the first in a wave of protests across the Arab world that we now call the Arab Spring. It saw the end of the reign of Zine Al-Abidine Ben Ali, who'd been the president of Tunisia for 23 years. He was the first dictator to fall in the Arab Spring, and he was also the only one to flee the country. So Erin, why exactly did Ben Ali flee when so many other dictators stayed?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting, an interesting point to be made. And Cyrus and I are going to talk back and forth a little bit about some of the things today. We're talking about the flight of Ben Ali and the return of the rebels. Ben Ali, unlike so many other dictators in the Arab Spring, didn't dig in his heels and either, die fighting like Gaddafi next door in Libya, or start a civil war like Bashar al-Assad in Syria or what happened in Yemen. Instead, he got the hell out of Dodge. And there are a few really important factors that contributed to why he left. Part of it is that there was a really complicated political system that he inherited from Habib Bourguiba, who was the independence leader in Tunisia. But also part of it was that one of the components of that system that he inherited was that Bourguiba was a civilian and did not believe in a strong army. He believed in civilian government, and so he never built up an army. A lot of dictators in the Arab world really relied on the army to back them up when things went sideways. So in January of 2011, protests have been going on in Tunisia for about 4 or 5 weeks, or no, just 2-3 weeks, gosh, by the time January rolled around. But they've been going on in these small towns in the center of the country where nobody was really paying attention. There was a media blockade anyway, so people on the coast in big cities like Tunis, where we are right now, or in Sfax, had no idea what was happening. But then, on the weekend of January 8th and 9th, 2011, Zine Al-Abidine Ben Ali, the president and the dictator, gave the orders for the police force to use deadly force against protesters. Now, Ben Ali was actually an army man. He had come up through the army, and he had trained at Tunisia. At some point, he was even in Annapolis, Maryland, right?
Yeah. Fort Halberd
to train, but he had actually focused most of his energy on creating a strong police force, and he used them as a cudgel against his people for decades. So he, throughout the 80s and 90s, developed this relationship with the police where they would use intimidation and force in small, minor ways to keep people under control, but then also created this just brutal repression of political opposition. There were tens of thousands of political prisoners, people who were killed and tortured in prison, and the police force became this looming sense in Tunisia that basically kept people under control. But then they used deadly force against people, which they had done before, by the way, 2008 and other protests. But something changed this time. More than 100 people died that weekend. And unlike so many of the instances beforehand, these were recorded on smartphones or small camera phones. And people outside of these little areas found out about it. And protests erupted across the nation. Hundreds of thousands of people spilled out onto the streets in Tunis and Sfax, in big and small towns and neighborhoods around the country. And it overwhelmed the police force. Ben Ali's, iron fist was suddenly unclenching. And all of a sudden, the thing that he had to back him up wasn't there. So he goes to the general in charge of the armed forces and says, all right, guys, it's time to roll. And the general says, absolutely no way. Absolutely no way are we going to kill our own citizens. And this both enrages Ben Ali and terrifies him. So he goes back to the presidential palace, entrenches himself, and is trying to decide what to do. He gives a conciliatory speech. He goes on public television and says, I've heard you. We're going to give you YouTube. Everything's going to be fine. And it doesn't work. The next day, even more people are on the street. This is January 14th, 2011. And the president, or the head of the security forces, comes to Ben Ali and says, we don't think we can keep you safe. And so, in a very classic, like, dictator way, he goes back to the presidential palace, grabs his wife and his daughter, and shoves dozens of gold bullion bars into a suitcase. They grab jewelry, they grab cash, they stuff it in their underwear. It is like pure Romanov meets like Narcos action. And they get on the presidential jet and they head towards France because they think France is a pretty friendly ally, right? They had even kind of given military or offered some support for the protests.
Yeah, I mean, during the protests, the French Minister of Defense, Michel Alliot-Marie, I probably pronounced that wrong, had offered to lend French police force in their savoir-faire in controlling the protests to Tunisia.
But that did not end up very well for her.
No, it was later revealed that she had been vacationing during the protests in Tunisia as a guest of some of the Ben Ali's relatives.
Extremely flashy.
She lost her job.
Yeah, she lost her job. And also these people are like, just imagine like the most rich, opulent, absurd lifestyle. And this is what they were living. And this is what they were trying to shove on a jet. They get on a plane and they head towards France. And 3/4 of the way there, Nicolas Sarkozy gets wind of this. And he's a pretty good friend of Ben Ali. But he realizes that having a now defunct dictator hanging out in France is maybe not the best look. And so he says, désolé, hein? You gotta find a new place to go. So they make a hard right turn and a bunch of frantic phone calls and try and figure out where to land. And it turns out the one place in the world that is friendly to defunct dictators is
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. So they land in Jeddah, and Ben Ali says to the pilot, you stay here on the tarmac, gas up the jet, I'm going back. I'm just gonna get my wife and daughter settled. Turns out, as soon as he was out of the airfield, the pilots got permission and they took off without him and left him stranded. So this is the sort of wild madcap escape of Ben Ali. His family starts fleeing into the wind. They had been kind of a kleptocracy there. One of his sons disappears via a bunch of shell companies and lands in Montreal several months later. And in my favorite anecdote, his daughter and son-in-law, these people who had like pet tigers, there was like some real Tiger King vibes with these folks. They'd have like berries flown in from Saint-Tropez, whatever. They disappeared for a few days and then they turned up seeking asylum at Euro Disney because this is super classy. So anyway, Ben Ali is gone. He has fled, and there's this huge power vacuum. And they're trying to figure out what to do next. And there's one group of people who are poised and ready to go to lead Tunisia into the future, and that is the Islamists.
Yeah. Islamist is a term that I think, especially in the United States, is often used in pretty imprecise ways. And usually I think people think of terrorists, probably like Osama bin Laden, ISIS. Those guys are definitely Islamists, but that doesn't capture the breadth of Islamism. That's like saying, I mean, maybe if you're a Fox News fan, you'd hear things like this, but it's like saying that Maoist guerrillas and the Democrats are all liberals.
Just kidding.
The thing that unites Islamists is a belief that the problems in the Islamic world can be solved by returning to their cultural and religious roots and rejecting European forms of modernity. But there's a lot of different tactics and a lot of different discussions about what those mean. The main opposition to Ben Ali during his initial rise to power were an Islamist party called Ennahda. They were led by a man named Rashid Ghannouchi. He grew up in the south of Tunisia. He'd gotten a traditional Islamic education. He couldn't actually even go to college in Tunisia because he didn't speak French. He only spoke Arabic. But he led a movement that became the Ennahda Party. That was.
And see what Ennahda means.
Ennahda means Renaissance in Arabic.
So
Sorry about that.
That's okay. It's like rebirth of Islamic values and Islamic traditions, because Bourguiba had essentially, Bourguiba, the independence leader, had essentially made Tunisia a secular state.
Right. The goal of every leader of Tunisia since independence was to move Tunisia towards a secular, very European version of modernity. And Ennahda rejected that. And they wanted to move Tunisia to a more religious orientation. But the methods that they were committed to were peaceful protests, political organizing. They wanted to participate in a democratic process to accomplish those goals.
But that was not what Bourguiba or Ben Ali wanted.
No. And so there was a massive crackdown of Islamists during the 80s and 90s. When we talked about before, all those political prisoners, all the torture, all of the imprisonment, all the extrajudicial killings, the Islamists bore the brunt of that. At some point in the early 90s, there were some 30,000 Islamists in Tunisian jails. And the leadership, including Rashid Ghannouchi, realized that the only hope for the movement was if they got out of Tunisia. So Rashid Ghannouchi eventually got political asylum in the United Kingdom, in London, and the rest of the Ennahda Party leadership over the course of the 90s fled to Europe, to France, to Italy, across the European Union. And by the mid-90s, there was no organized Islamist movement left in Tunisia. But what was going on with Ennahda while they were in Europe?
Well, so this is super fascinating, and it's what helped poise them to take over. They got to Europe, right? A lot of these people, and I also want to, it's not like there's not constant flow back and forth between Tunisia and France, especially because it was a French protectorate. But a lot of these people moved to Europe and realized just how brutal it was to be brown and Muslim in a place like France or Italy or the UK. And they realized and recognized that if they wanted their community's interests to be represented, then they needed to be involved in the decision-making process. So a lot of Tunisians got involved in civil society because they had obviously come from a place that has never had a democracy, has only ever had a one-party system. And you land smack dab in the middle of democracy. And basically, they show up and realize that they need to start participating in the democracy. So they help me out. I just lost my train of thought.
No, so they get involved in the civil society organizations in democratic processes in Europe.
Exactly, right. And so one of the things that we loved about doing our podcast, and forgive me, I had like a brain fart there. One of the things we loved about doing our podcast is we got to talk to all kinds of different people. Unlike many of our fellow colleagues here at Intelligent Speech, we get to deal with history that is still in the process of happening, that happened just a decade ago. So we interviewed about 40, 50 people for Revolution 1. And one of the people that we interviewed was a woman named Zine Al-Abidine. She and her husband had moved to France in the 80s for his PhD. They weren't political exiles, they were just there studying, but both of them were Muslim and were active. And Zine, who spoke both French and English, she was a translator and a really sharp lady, got involved with the various Muslim civil society organizations. And in 1989, she was at this meeting of Muslims in France. It was actually Muslims of all of Europe. And they had invited imams from Kuwait, from Saudi Arabia, from these really conservative places to come and address the group there. And she said that it was the most dull and boring conference because there were these really crucial issues happening right then in France. France had just made it illegal for girls to wear the hijab in school. And conservative Muslim families were trying to decide whether they were going to send their girls to school or not. And Rashid Khanouchi, who had initially gone to France for exile, but France actually realized that they wanted to maintain a better relationship with Tunisia than they wanted to have an Islamist in exile there, sent him to the UK. But Rashid Khanouchi was in town for this conference, and somebody gave him 15 minutes to address the audience. And he stood up and he said, look, you want to talk about your girls wearing hijabs in school? He's like, they are already immigrants. They are already Muslims. They are already on the edges of society. And you want to add economic marginalization and ignorance to that? It's like, this is not how you get the things that you want. Like, your first priority should be education. Your second priority should be education. Your third priority should be education. And then we can talk about what people should wear. And Marcia, who at the time was in her 30s, like late 20s, early 30s, conservative Muslim woman wearing a hijab, is so moved by this, she stands up and gives him a standing ovation. Everybody was looking at her like she was crazy. But she said this idea that he instilled in her, that citizenship comes first, and that if you want to be able to do the things that matter to you, right? He's like, if you want your girls to be able to wear hijab in school, you don't do that by pulling them out of school and not participating. He's like, you do that by getting involved.